You're 70 years old, looking in the mirror, and what do you see? Society says decline is inevitable. That's rubbish. Age doesn't matter when you have these 6 powerful habits. Frank, at 72, completely transformed his life after retirement. What separated him wasn't youth. It was deliberate psychological patterns that restructured his existence. These aren't motivational platitudes. They're battle-tested principles that work regardless of your birth certificate. Most men surrender to age rather than conquering it. They accept comfortable obsolescence when they could stand upright, facing life with purpose. The first transformative habit requires something many abandon in their later years. Most men over 65 wake up without a battle plan for their day. They drift through morning routines established decades ago, but now leading nowhere. Purpose isn't some abstract concept. It's the fundamental psychological structure that gives meaning to each hour you're alive. Without it, your mind begins the slow descent into what I call retirement fog, where Monday feels exactly like Saturday, and life's richness fades into a gray sameness. Frank's apartment used to echo with this emptiness every morning after his retirement from accounting. For Frank, mornings had become torturous stretches of nothingness. He'd wake up, sometimes not until 9 or 10, shuffling around in slippers, watching the news channel while nursing lukewarm coffee. This wasn't living, it was merely existing. The man had worked 43 years building a career that demanded his attention every waking moment. Then suddenly, nothing demanded anything of him. His days stretched out like an empty road with no destination in sight. I felt useless, Frank admitted. My wife had her garden club, her book circle, her volunteer work. I had ESPN and leftovers. His sense of identity had been so wrapped up in his work that retirement felt like an amputation of his very self. This is precisely the trap so many men fall into, allowing their purpose to be dictated entirely by external structures that eventually disappear. Everything changed when Frank established what I call a purpose framework, a daily structure built around meaningful activities that require his unique abilities. He didn't reinvent his entire life overnight. He started small, establishing 3 non-negotiable purposeful actions each day. First, he committed to a 7 a.m. wake-up, regardless of how he felt. This wasn't about torture, it was about reclaiming authority over his own existence. Second, he established a 2-hour morning block dedicated to learning Spanish, a language he'd always wanted to speak. Third, he scheduled one social connection every day, either in person or by phone. The key was specificity. I don't just study Spanishes, Frank explained. I complete one lesson and have a 5-minute conversation with my language exchange partner in Mexico City. This level of detail eliminated the vagueness that kills motivation in older men. Frank's transformation hinged on what I call a purpose activation system, a physical reminder of his daily commitments. He created a simple notebook where he wrote down his 3 purposeful actions each evening for the next day. Then he'd physically check them off as he completed them. This wasn't just busy work, it was a fundamental restructuring of his relationship with time. Each checkmark represented a promise kept to himself. Small victories accumulated day after day, rebuilding his sense of competence and control. The notebook sits on my nightstand, Frank said. Last thing I see at night, first thing I see in the morning. No technology, no complications, just me keeping my word to myself. Within 3 months, Frank experienced what all purpose-driven men discover. Time moved differently. Mondays had texture again. Thursdays held anticipation. His Spanish skills progressed enough to watch television programs without subtitles. His social calendar filled with meaningful connections. Most importantly, the fog lifted. His mind, once drifting aimlessly, now engaged fully with each day. He stopped talking about killing time and started investing it. The man who once struggled to fill empty hours now found himself prioritizing activities based on their meaning and contribution to his goals. True purpose isn't found in grand gestures or dramatic life changes. It's built in the daily actions that align with your deepest values. Frank discovered what every vital older man knows, that purpose isn't something you retire from. It's something you recommit to every single morning when your feet hit the floor. The body isn't separate from the mind. It's the physical manifestation of your psychological state. Most men over 65 approach physical movement all wrong. They believe they need to recapture the athletic capabilities of their 30s, or worse, they surrender to complete sedentary existence. Both approaches fundamentally misunderstand what movement means at this stage of life. For Frank, movement had become something to avoid, a reminder of what he could no longer do, rather than an affirmation of what remained possible. Frank's relationship with his body had deteriorated into a series of complaints and limitations. His arthritis had become his identity. His back problems had become his excuse. I used to tell everyone about my conditions before they even asked how I was doing, Frank admitted. It was like I was introducing my ailments instead of myself. This physical surrender created a feedback loop that rippled through every aspect of his existence. He declined social invitations because of anticipated discomfort. He'd avoid going places that required walking more than short distances. His world literally shrank to the distance he felt comfortable moving, from his recliner to the refrigerator to the bathroom and back again. The most insidious part? Frank believed he was simply being realistic about his limitations. In reality, he was negotiating his surrender to time, one avoided movement at a time. Frank's transformation began with a radical reframing of what movement meant. Instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, he shifted his attention to what remained possible. This wasn't positive thinking, it was pragmatic realism based on how the human body actually responds to consistent, appropriate movement. My doctor told me something that changed everything, Frank said. He said the pain of movement is temporary, but the pain of immobility is permanent. That hit me like a truck. Frank established what I call a movement baseline, the minimum physical activity he committed to regardless of how he felt on any given day. For him, it was a 15-minute walk every morning, even if he only made it to the end of his driveway and back. The distance wasn't the point, the commitment was. Frank developed his physical resilience protocol, a set of movements specifically tailored to his unique body and limitations. He worked with a physical therapist to identify 5 core strengthening exercises that addressed his particular weaknesses without aggravating his existing conditions. The protocol wasn't designed to make him an athlete again. It was created to restore his functional independence and extend his capacity for meaningful living. 3 times weekly, he performed these movements with religious consistency, tracking his progress not through weight lifted or distance covered, but through functional achievements. Last year I couldn't pick up my grandson, Frank said. 2 weeks ago I not only picked him up, I carried him around the zoo for 20 minutes when he got tired. That's better than any medal or trophy. The most unexpected benefit came from how movement reconnected Frank to the world around him. His daily walks expanded from his driveway to his neighborhood to local parks. He began to notice details in his environment that had been invisible before: seasonal changes, architectural details, the patterns of bird migrations. Movement became his gateway back into full sensory participation in the world. He joined a senior hiking group that took gentle, hour-long walks on local trails twice weekly. These weren't athletic challenges, they were moving conversations with other men and women rediscovering their bodies' capabilities. "We call ourselves the Creaky Hikers," Frank laughed. "Nobody's setting speed records, but we're all expanding our worlds one step at a time." Through consistent, appropriate movement, Frank discovered what every vital older man eventually learns: that the body can be reclaimed, not through feats of strength, but through patient, persistent recommitment to its fundamental capacity for movement. His arthritis didn't disappear, but it no longer defined the boundaries of his possible life. Isolation kills more senior men than heart disease, not just physically, but existentially. The research is clear: social disconnection predicts mental decline better than almost any other factor. Yet most men approach their social lives after 65 with passive resignation, allowing connections to fade away without strategic replacement. Isolation isn't just lonely, it's neurotoxic. Frank's social world had collapsed to near invisibility after his wife's passing, creating what I call a connection vacuum. After losing his wife of 42 years, Frank's social network disintegrated almost overnight. "Joan was our social coordinator," he explained. "She kept track of birthdays, organized dinners, maintained friendships. When she died, I didn't just lose my wife, I lost my entire social infrastructure." Within 6 months, Frank's phone stopped ringing. The dinner invitations ceased. His calendar emptied of all meaningful human contact. Frank fell into the trap that captures countless widowed men. He expected others to reach out to him rather than taking responsibility for rebuilding his social world. "I kept waiting for people to check on me," Frank said. "Some did at first, but everyone has their own lives, their own problems. Eventually, I became an obligation rather than a friend. This passive approach to connection is precisely what pushes many older men into dangerous isolation. Frank's transformation began when he developed what I call a connection reconstruction blueprint, a strategic approach to rebuilding social bonds based on mutual value rather than obligation or pity. The blueprint started with a brutally honest inventory of his existing relationships, categorized by depth and frequency of contact. He discovered what many isolated men realize: his social world had been primarily maintained through his wife's efforts and his workplace structure. Without those scaffolds, he needed to build connection through direct, intentional effort. Frank established 3 categories of connection he would actively pursue: legacy relationships, old friends and family needing rekindling; interest-based relationships, connections through shared activities; and mentoring relationships, sharing wisdom with younger people. I had to stop thinking about socializing as something that happened to me and start seeing it as something I created, Frank explained. This shift from passive to active connection building changed everything. For Frank, technology became an unexpected ally in his social reconstruction. Despite initial resistance, he embraced what I call digital bridge building, using technology not as a replacement for face-to-face connection, but as a pathway toward it. Frank joined 2 Facebook groups aligned with his interests: classic car restoration and amateur astronomy. These provided low-pressure environments to practice social skills while connecting around shared passions. He scheduled regular video calls with his grandchildren, transforming sporadic contact into consistent connection. At first, I felt ridiculous learning Facebook at my age, Frank admitted, but I realized something important: pride is a luxury lonely people can't afford. The technology served as training wheels, helping him rebuild conversational confidence and social rhythms that had atrophied during his isolation. The key was using digital tools as a means rather than an end, each online interaction aimed toward eventual in-person connection. Frank established his weekly connection commitment, a non-negotiable schedule of at least 3 meaningful social interactions every week. He tracked these in the same notebook where he recorded his purposeful actions, giving social connection the same priority as any other essential life activity. The commitment wasn't about quantity but quality of interaction. A 30-minute conversation with his neighbor about their shared interest in woodworking counted more than hours at a senior center event where he spoke superficially with dozens of people. I had to learn to be intentional about conversations, Frank said, to ask better questions, to listen more carefully, to reveal more about myself. These aren't just social skills, they're survival skills at my age. Through strategic, intentional connection building, Frank discovered what every socially resilient senior man knows: that meaningful relationships don't happen by accident after 65. They're built through deliberate effort, appropriate vulnerability, and regular investment. His social world became a source of vitality rather than a reminder of loss. Your brain follows one immutable law: it either grows or it dies. There is no maintenance mode. Most men over 65 succumb to intellectual stagnation, believing their capacity for learning peaked decades ago. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of neuroscience and human potential. Your neural pathways remain plastic throughout life, constantly reorganizing based on stimulation and challenge. Frank had fallen into the cognitive comfort zone that slowly suffocates mental vitality. After retirement, Frank's intellectual life flatlined. The man who once mastered complex accounting regulations and led staff trainings now limited his mental stimulation to crossword puzzles and television news. I told myself I'd earned the right to stop learning, Frank admitted, that my brain had done enough heavy lifting for one lifetime. This rationalization masked a deeper fear: that he couldn't learn new skills at his age, that attempting to master new domains would only highlight his cognitive decline. This fear of intellectual inadequacy kept him trapped in diminishing returns, retreating to increasingly narrow bands of familiar knowledge. The few times Frank attempted something new, like setting up a streaming service on his television, failures reinforced his belief that new learning was beyond him. I'd try once, get frustrated, and call my son to fix it. Then I'd tell myself, this technology isn't designed for people my age anyway. This self-defeating pattern locked him in a shrinking intellectual world. Frank's transformation began when he implemented what I call a curiosity reactivation system, a structured approach to rekindling intellectual engagement through progressive challenges. He started with a learning inventory, honestly assessing skills he'd always wanted to develop but had postponed or abandoned. Photography topped his list, a passion he'd set aside decades earlier while building his career and raising children. Rather than overwhelming himself with equipment research or advanced techniques, Frank established a simple framework: 30 minutes daily devoted to learning one specific photographic skill. I started with just learning how to control exposure on a basic digital camera, Frank explained. Nothing fancy, just understanding the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I treated it like a laboratory experiment rather than an art form at first. This methodical approach bypassed the emotional obstacles that derail many older learners: impatience, frustration, and unrealistic expectations. Frank focused on mastery of micro skills rather than grand achievements, building confidence through incremental progress. Frank developed his learning ladder protocol, a step-by-step progression from beginner knowledge to functional competence in any new domain. Each rung represented a specific sub-skill that built on previous knowledge while extending his capabilities. For photography, his ladder began with camera basics, progressed to composition principles, then to editing techniques, and eventually to specialized styles like landscape and portrait photography. Each level had clear success criteria, preventing the vague sense of inadequacy that often plagues older learners. The key was removing emotion from the learning process, Frank said. When I took a terrible photograph, I didn't think, "I'm not artistic." I thought, "My understanding of composition needs work." It was diagnostic rather than judgmental. This detached approach to learning protected his motivation through inevitable setbacks. More importantly, it rekindled the intellectual curiosity that had defined his younger years, but had gradually eroded through decades of focusing on. While Frank was rebuilding his mind through active learning, he simultaneously developed the habit of mindful reflection, a practice many men dismiss as spiritualistic nonsense until they experience its concrete benefits. Frank established a simple evening ritual of recording 3 specific moments from each day that evoked genuine gratitude. This wasn't about positive thinking. It was about training his attention to recognize value that actually existed but had been previously filtered out of his awareness. I realized I'd been walking around with negative filters over my eyes for years, Frank explained. Not seeing beauty or kindness or opportunity, only problems, losses, and limitations. The reflection practice created space between himself and his automatic responses to life circumstances. When his back pain flared, he acknowledged the discomfort without allowing it to define his entire day or self-perception. When social interactions became challenging, he observed his anxiety without being consumed by it. "Before, my thoughts were like a runaway train," Frank said. "Now there's enough space to decide which thoughts deserve my energy and which ones I can let pass by." This mental discipline transformed his daily experience more profoundly than any external circumstance could have changed it. The final habit that transforms aging from decline into ascendance is something most men completely misunderstand: the creation of legacy through deliberate mentorship. The psychological literature is unambiguous. Generativity, contributing to future generations, is essential for psychological well-being in later life. It's not optional, it's not a luxury, it's a fundamental requirement of the human psyche. Frank had been living in what I call a legacy vacuum, consuming resources without creating ongoing value. After retirement, Frank's relationship with his accumulated wisdom grew increasingly problematic. Decades of professional knowledge and life experience sat dormant, like a library no one visited. "I kept trying to give advice to my adult children," Frank confessed. "They'd smile politely and ignore everything I said. Eventually, I stopped offering any guidance at all." This rejection created a profound existential crisis. The knowledge and wisdom he'd spent a lifetime accumulating suddenly seemed worthless. His experience appeared irrelevant in a rapidly changing world. This perceived obsolescence fed directly into his deepening depression and sense of purposelessness. "I started to wonder what the point of all my life experience was," Frank said. "If nobody wanted what I knew, what was the value of having lived through all those years?" This question haunts countless older men who haven't discovered appropriate channels for their wisdom. Frank's transformation began when he developed what I call a legacy construction framework, a strategic approach to identifying where his specific knowledge and wisdom could provide genuine value to others. Rather than forcing unwanted advice on family members, he systematically assessed where his experience actually matched current needs. The framework started with a rigorous inventory of his knowledge domains, skills, and life lessons, from technical accounting knowledge to personal wisdom about marriage, career challenges, and overcoming setbacks. He then identified potential recipients who might genuinely benefit from this knowledge. I realized my adult children weren't the right audience for most of my wisdom, Frank explained. They're in a different world with different challenges, but there were plenty of other people who actually needed exactly what I knew. This shift from pushing wisdom onto reluctant recipients to finding appropriate audiences transformed Frank's relationship with his own life experience. Frank established what I call mentorship channels, specific relationships and platforms through which his knowledge could flow to appropriate recipients. He volunteered with SCORE, a nonprofit organization connecting retired business professionals with entrepreneurs needing guidance. He discovered that while his adult children weren't interested in his financial advice, first-generation college students from his community desperately needed exactly that knowledge. He began meeting weekly with 3 students, helping them navigate financial aid, budgeting, and career planning. The first time one of these kids called me just to say they'd followed my advice about compound interest and opened their first investment account, I felt more valuable than I had in years, Frank said. Not because I'm special, but because what I know actually mattered to someone. The mentorship wasn't one-directional. Frank received technological guidance from younger protégés, creating reciprocal value exchanges that dignified both parties. This mutual benefit overcame the charity dynamic that makes many older men reluctant to engage with younger generations. Frank initiated his legacy documentation project, a systematic effort to record his most valuable knowledge, stories, and wisdom. Rather than assuming others would automatically appreciate his life experience, he curated it carefully, focusing on universally applicable insights rather than contextually specific details. He started a simple blog sharing financial wisdom for first-generation college students. He recorded video interviews about his life experiences during significant historical events for his grandchildren to access when they were older. He wrote a short guide to navigating grief after losing a spouse, which his church distributed to recently widowed members. I stopped seeing my experiences as just my personal history, Frank explained. I started recognizing them as potential resources for others facing similar challenges. That changed everything about how I valued my own past. Through strategic mentorship and legacy documentation, Frank discovered what every generative older man eventually learns, that wisdom shared appropriately multiplies in value rather than diminishes with age. His life experience became a renewable resource rather than a depreciating asset, energizing his present while extending his influence into a future beyond his own lifespan. These 6 habits aren't just suggestions, they're psychological imperatives for any man who refuses to surrender to time's passage. Your age is just a number, but your habits are your destiny. The choice between vitality and decline isn't made in doctors' offices or written in genetic code. It's forged daily in the crucible of your decisions. Each habit builds upon the others, creating an integrated architecture of meaningful existence regardless of the number of years behind you. The alternative is clear and catastrophic. Drift without purpose, movement, connection, learning, reflection, or legacy leads inevitably to the psychological death that precedes the physical. So ask yourself, will you be a passive witness to your own diminishment, or the conscious architect of your ongoing becoming? The clock is ticking. What are you waiting for?